Okay, let's make a start. Good evening. My name is David Cook. I am the ACS Vice President for Academic, and I'm very happy to welcome you to a new pilot series that we're running, and we're starting it tonight. It's called ACS Think Tank. And to be clear, this is a very inclusive event. Anyone who takes part tonight is automatically a member of ACS Think Tank, and it's a space where we meet to touch and discuss the hard stuff. It's about where we talk about the things that keep us awake at night. Tonight's event is looking at a particular topic called passwords, privacy and power, and the ever-present challenge of privacy versus data utility. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation upon whose lands I speak today, and I recognise the traditional custodians of the lands upon which we all gather, wherever we are, all across Australia. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge the ACS Diversity Pledge, that we see the value in welcoming a diverse cross-section of people from all pathways, all identities and all individual views and thoughts. ACS Think Tank is designed to look at the wicked and the intractable problems within our ICT industry. We do this in an open town hall Q&A style setting. Whether you are here in person, whether you're online or whether you're viewing this after the event, your views and your opinions are important to the ACS. Our aim is to provide an opportunity for professional members to unpack the difficult problems, to better understand the complexities about ICT challenges. And with your help, we will gain better insight so that we can give some direction to the industry, direction to the profession, to ACS policy, to help advisory bodies representing the interests of ACS members. Tonight's event is about passwords, privacy and power. And to do that, we are lucky to be joined by a panel of experts. To my left and to your right, we have ACS Vice President for Communities and Director of Technology and Security Assurance at BRM Advisory, Jo Stewart-Rattray. We have the Chair of Standards Australia AI and the Chair of the ACS AI Ethics Committees and a member of the New South Wales Government AI Advisory Committee, Aurélie Jacquet. And we have the Vice Chair of the ACS Data Sharing Committee and the CEO of Ambiata, Stephen Hardy. And joining us online all the way from Germany, we have the Principal Consultant and Co-Lead for the Cognitive and Analytics Practice for ISG, Dorothea Baljevic. Please, these are our panel. Put your hands up and make them welcome. Yay. So a few important details before we kick off. Firstly, tonight's event will be recorded and it'll be made available to members through the ACS members portal. So if you missed parts of it or you want to go back to it, you'll be able to do that. Secondly, during the session, we encourage your audience participation and your debate. However, we do ask that you remain respectful at all times and to be tolerant. Please ensure that you are muted when you are not speaking so we don't have a raucous collection of background noise. And thirdly, for the strong silent types amongst us, any formalised questions and comments could also be submitted by our virtual audience. You can type them in through the Q&A function, which you can see online, and we'll review that through this session. So let's kick this off. Our first question comes from Andrew Crawford from New South Wales, and he asks this important question. The government passed the Assistance and Access Act in 2018. Does this legislation potentially invite systematic weakness? What are the likely real-world impacts that the legislation prevents organisations from discussing orders, and does this unfairly disadvantage Australian businesses? As an industry, where do we stand? I'm going to ask Jo Stewart-Rattray. Jo.
Thanks, David, and thanks for the very short question, Andrew. Really pleased with that one. The short answer to the first section is no. The Act expressly forbids the creation of backdoors and security weaknesses. And it certainly doesn't encourage providers not to continue their patching regimes whilst they may be under an access and assistance request. If I look at the real world impacts, how many providers actually know about this piece of legislation? That's the question I ask. Because let's be honest, this country runs on small to medium enterprise. Is this something that a small to medium telecommunications provider or managed services provider would have in front of mind? I wonder. As we're not speaking about orders issued under the Act, we're talking here about serious crimes. Any crime related would have to bring with it at least a 3-year, if not greater, sentence with it. So we're talking serious crimes. So silence in that sort of case, I think, is fairly reasonable. And the Act also states that requests that are made for assistance and access to providers must not under any circumstances impact that business. So agencies who might be making those requests, so law enforcement, has to actually consider the impact to the business before continuing with the request. A provider cannot be asked to comply with the impossible. That's the other thing that's really important here. However, if they say they are not capable technically of assisting, it may be that an independent third party is brought in to determine whether that's actually true or not. Now, if it requires a third party to assist them to access, for the access assistance request, that would not be at the provider's expense, but they would be reasonably compensated for such a request. The Act does allow for warrants under old-fashioned computer access warrants that allow law enforcement to covertly access devices, search them and collect data and information, and cover up, this is the bit that I am a little bit about, cover up the fact that the device has been accessed. And I bring your attention to what happened in the United States after the Microsoft hack. The FBI made some very broad-based statements and said that organisations, you have 1 month in which to comply and ensure your systems are patched. Now, many top end of town organisations did not. So the FBI went and got warrants to allow them to actually go into corporate systems and patch on behalf of those organisations. And it did come out after the event and they actually publicised it. But that worries me that we're walking down a path where that could actually be the case. However, this legislation is not as bad as it might be. My concern is this legislation. This legislation is the Australia-US Cloud Act Agreement, which doesn't come into effect until the end of this year. It has to pass through the House of Representatives here and Congress in the US. And this enables agencies both in the States and here to make requests directly to managed services and telecommunications providers to access data.
And so can I jump in there? Yes. I want to hear from some of the other people. Harley and Stephen, have you got any thoughts about this? Can I just go back to the point about whether this legislation, invites weaknesses? I mean, in the real world, it's great when we talk about a big case such as Microsoft. What happens in the middle ground? Is there a difference there in terms of, is this toothless in terms of legislation? What's the impact in real terms?
I wouldn't call it toothless, no. But at the same time, with that, in my personal opinion, there are no good backdoors. There should never be any backdoors in cryptographic systems. Just introducing. But
that's actually strictly forbidden, right?
Yep. But there has certainly been, I think, an impression that's been built up over the last 4 or 5 years that Australia's a little bit tilting towards the access into systems that allow law enforcement to otherwise access information that they wouldn't be able to. This is the impression that people overseas are having.
You're right, Stephen, it's an impression. Yep. It's actually strictly forbade by the Act. So.
Yep, that may be the case, but I certainly have personal experience of having been in the US, talking about cutting-edge cryptographic technologies for protecting privacy, and having the response. Well, Australia is essentially shooting themselves in the foot with the legislative approaches that they take in that regard. So that was a personal experience from someone who wouldn't have understood Australian legislation, but certainly it's the perception that was, and this was 4 or 5 years ago, certainly the perception that was being aired at the time.
I think there is an interesting point, the Australia versus US approach. And if we look at this Australia-US Cloud Act agreement, for instance, we cannot be disadvantaged because it needs to actually stack up with our privacy laws as well. So that's one thing about it. I'm not speaking in favour of it, it's just a fact. So,
Marlene, any thoughts before we go to the next question?
I think I'll make a short comment. From my perspective, I think this is a good illustration of one common problem we've got, where when you're looking at local laws, especially when it comes to technology, cyber, it's very much looking at the international ecosystem, not just the local ecosystem, and making sure that whatever laws we build here, it's in cognition of the broader ecosystem.
Thank you.
yeah, really good point.
I'm going to move, pardon me, I'm going to move to the next question, but for those of you online, if you have thoughts about this, put them in the comments. Let's know what you think. I'm going to go to the next question because I want to keep moving along with this. And I'm going to turn to someone online who's in WA. Janine Williams, you've got a question for us. Give us your question.
Thank you, David. My question, human rights to privacy, is it a right, is it a privilege, or is it just information? And what do we mean when we say I have the right to keep that information private? I'm looking at things like the recent examples of the COVID-19 and domestic terrorism. Is it okay to break privacy? And what are the acceptable reasons?
Great question. Orally, kick us off on this one.
Sure. So that's an excellent question. So when it comes to privacy, is it a right? Is it a privilege? I think this is a really nice framing. It's a right that's becoming more and more of a privilege. So what's happening is privacy law has been built originally to protect people from spying into you in your garden, for your nosy neighbors to come and look at what's happening in your garden. That's what it's been built for. What we see now is it's no longer the neighbors you need to worry about, but with the expansion of data and technology, there's a big change there. And the GDPR laws caught up a little bit with this, but there's still a big change. So I'd say, if you say with privacy, it's a little bit like when a new king arrives, you say, oh, the king is dead, long live the king. Now it's privacy is dead, long live the new version of privacy. There's lots of regulators in Europe and is that have been considering whether privacy as it is dead and whether there's a need to change the way we approach privacy. So as there was a technology like AI, like quantum, with the different structures that exist, there's a strong evolution there. Is privacy about information? Yes, privacy law currently as they're drafted are about information, but it's changing. You see, obviously, it's all about inferences. It's about insights. It's no longer about just you as a person, but there's a growing push to say that it's about communities, the inference you made about a group of people. There's a big push for that in Europe, and I think we see some change happening. Maybe not just in the privacy world, we see also the consumer regulators taking a strong stance there. And to your last point, can we breach privacy? So I'm a lawyer from background, so I'll say I strongly advise you not to breach the law. What we see though is there's currently in the privacy law some carve out on how you can access data. So there's some carve out that are provided to different institutions, and this varies according to the different privacy laws. What's tricky though is privacy law are changing fast because they need to adapt to effectively the new environment, and that's why you see more principle based. Like that's why privacy laws, the latest one, are more principle based, and that's why it's going to be really interesting to see those development as to what's changing from a community perspective and what's going to be allowed, more allowed and less allowed, and we should really very much closely watch those changes.
Aurelie, you mentioned the push from Europe. I wonder if we can go to our fourth panelist in Dorothea. What does it look like in Europe? You're in Germany right now. Explain that a little bit more.
So what's actually interesting, I was here when GDPR was first enacted, then I went back to Australia, and then I've come back again. So I remember very, very vividly, as soon as GDPR was enacted, every single website asked me a series of questions that do you consent? And it was not a yes and no. This was a toggle of sometimes 35 individual consent laws and regulations. I came back to Australia and it was absent. And I thought, hold on, neither one is actually a good medium, because one is a little too excessive and the other one is ignoring the fact. Now, coming back a few years later, there's obviously been a lot of feedback into saying, how can we do this more appropriately? And what I see is the purpose-led version, which I quite like. It's, are you actually going to be providing consent? If yes, what levels for it? And this is the purpose we have, and making it super simple for the consumer to actually understand. And Janine, that question around human rights, philosophers argue that we should have human rights for the privacy, but then we are a species, so we can't live alone. We can't be isolated. So for our evolution and involvement, we do need to have a certain level of what do we share to continue to grow, but we don't want that to be abused. We want that for our growth, for our development, for our innovation, and that's where that discussion needs to not just be had with legislators, but a interdisciplinary group of people. Where I'm in Deutschland, and I'll cover that a little bit in GDPR, it is front and center, even before computers, cloud computing came into play. It was very, very much a security sensitive, privacy sensitive culture and organization, businesses, individuals. So Orly, when you said you can't expect noisy neighbors, I know in some parts of Germany, it is legal to check whether your neighbor has made sure that they've cut the grass at a certain length to keep, you know, neatness in a manicured garden. So it is allowed, again, depending on cultural contexts. In Australia, I'm sure that would not, it would be heavily frowned upon and maybe even illegal in some of the states.
Stephen, what does it look like in Sydney? Is it the same? Are we going in the same direction?
Well, the legislative changes are coming down the pipe, and I don't know exactly what it will look like, but it's going to be closer to GDPR than it has been. So that's changing. But actually, my personal interest is very much on the last part of that question, which is, you know, when do you have the right to say no about your data being used? Right? And so think about the benefit that comes from the census, right? Really understanding what the population is like and having better knowledge of what's going on in terms of, you know, health, you know, environment, all these sorts of things. It's all driven by data, and that data, when it's aggregated properly and safely, can be collected in ways that doesn't tell you something about an individual, which is typically where, you know, privacy has aimed at, is around individual information, whether or not it's personal information or sensitive information. And I think that public benefit means that there are cases where people should not have the right to refuse to share their information. Right? That's my personal view. The public good outweighs the personal good of having their privacy protected. Thankfully, the technology landscape is changing a lot at the moment. There are lots of new technologies for encryption that let you use data without disclosing it. These things called zero-knowledge proofs that let you answer questions without releasing your data. So lots of complicated cryptographic things that are coming into production and will be in use in the next 5 years that I think will make people more comfortable, at least technologists who understand how they work will be more comfortable around that trade-off between public good use and, you know, private protection of information. But that's me being a bit optimistic.
I'm going to check in now, and we're going to have a look at what the rest of Australia thinks. So I'm going to have a look and see, are there any questions, online questions or things from the audience that are worth putting up? If we can go to that comment and see if there's anything there. So I'll just read out, we've got some questions and comments here. Should we be aligning to GDPR standards here in Australia? Any question? Joe, would you like to answer that one?
I'd love to answer that. Having been involved at the beginning with GDPR as an apparently international expert in the space, because of, you know, me looking at it from an international perspective and the impact and impost it would have here. There is an impost on the small to medium enterprise, and as I've already said, this country runs on small to medium enterprise, so we have to be aware of that. The other thing that we are actually currently seeing is there's this thing called the interoperability across government, where government departments share information. So if we have some tighter laws, whether they be GDPR or not, I think we might see a bit of a change in that interoperability. Also, I think we as individuals need to understand why data is being gathered, and we should have the right to ask the question, what is this data being gathered for, and is it going to be used only for that purpose? I think that's the important thing there. The other thing for technologists is GDPR, you have the right to be forgotten digitally, except you can't expunge your criminal record. But the right to be forgotten. Now, for some technologists, and again, for some small to medium enterprise, that presents a problem. How do you do that effectively? Because it has to be from backups as well as from day-to-day data.
Okay, and there's a second question, which is good because it's also about abuse of power. New South Wales Police recently banned climate activists from using encrypted messaging apps like Signal. Do you think this is an appropriate use of state power? Can you ever safely ban the use of encryption? Aurelie, what do you think?
I think I'm going to use this question to argue against my colleague, because I do think, yes, ultimately we want a society where we can leverage data that is going to help us grow. The problem is currently we have zero guarantee of this being the data that we give being used for the purpose we've given it. And we have no choice. It's not because if you give consent to use data to your bank, unless, what's your choice? You need to give that data, otherwise you don't have a bank account, you can't operate. So consent in a privacy world has never, ever been the first mechanism to obtain the data, and there's a lot of debate on whether it should be used that often. So to the extent I agree with Stephen, yes, it's been talked about to have data community, but as I said, this example from the New South Wales Police, where you're kind of forced to not have your encrypted data, but have got no known on how it's going to be used and whether it's going to be used against you. That's the problem. And I think that's the problem we see today with individuals. The trust is falling because there's privacy incident every single day, and because they have no clue and they do not trust organization that they will use the data, not against them.
Stephen, what's the response to that?
Actually, I basically mostly agree with you in the sense that I agree. Consent is a pantomime, right? It's not a real thing, and at the moment there are no ways of guaranteeing that data will only be used for the purpose that you release it for. Right? That's certainly true. I don't think that will remain true over the next 10 years, right? But there's a lot of work to be done in building systems that can do that, and will only be done for important areas. Now, it doesn't really read on this case. I'm not sure what the camera's doing at the moment, but
we might have dropped the camera.
I don't think it really reads on this encryption case per se. I mean, a judge made an order. I'm not going to make any comments about judges' orders and what they're going to do. Hey, we're back. But in terms of the actual, it's this trade-off that people have around, even though we have no trust, how do you, at the moment, have no trust? How do we actually build that trust up over time? How do we reverse this, trust deficit? And that involves actually acting in ways that are trustful, right? And so how we actually encourage, government, organisations, businesses to act in ways that are more, trust enabling, trust generating. That's kind of the key.
So this is the thing here. This is one of the reasons we brought together Think Tank, because there's always more than one side to the argument, and these are complex questions. We're not trying to solve them tonight. We're trying to open up discussion so we understand some of the problems even more clearly. And with that, I think we're going to go to someone who occasionally speaks clearly himself. I'm going to go to Tom Worthington in Canberra. Tom, you've got another question for us. What's your question?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so we've talked about the Europe's GDPR, very hard to say. So they have fines that can be hundreds of millions of dollars, percentage of a company's turnover internationally, but that doesn't remedy the release of private information, it's still released. Are there more appropriate remedies, and who should be held accountable when that happens? Should we send people to jail?
Great question. Dorothea, I'm going to go to you on this one. What's your thoughts?
Thank you, Tom. It's such an excellent question, because just can I set the scene for people that everyone has heard of GDPR, General Data Protection Rules, but do they actually understand what it is? So if you don't mind, Tom, indulge me for a minute before I then dive into the penalty side. So what Tom was alluding to, a company can be fined 10 million or 4% of their global revenue for the last year if they're caught breaching these data privacy rules and regulations. This was intended to be the few millions. We're now reaching the total of last year billions of dollars, of euros we're talking about, of breaches. The top 6 offenders in the last year, it's not companies, so Joe, you were talking about small to medium enterprises, they don't have the infrastructure, maybe they don't have the talent. These are global giants, ones that we use all the time, ones that we maybe share our social and private information on. So it's not lack of capability or capacity. Amazon beat this, and this is not something to be proud of, close to 800 million euros in one breach. And there's multiple players in each of these. So back to the whole penalties, what we're trying to protect is the privacy. So as I mentioned, in Europe, there's already been this culture. The EU courts consider privacy a human right. So GDPR was actually just extending that out for businesses and organizations, that we shouldn't be misusing and abusing the data at all. Enacted in 2018, 2021, we've got 900 fines and counting. They're still finding more. So what is the difficult part about this? Obviously, penalties don't just work. The monetary side is not valuable enough for organizations to say, we need to stop doing this. Yes, it has the fear factor for small businesses, and I've had conversations with them saying, we don't want to be caught out, but that stifles innovation. That also stifles progress. That's not the part that we want to head towards. Now, in my other part of my life, I actually do research on ethical organizational decision-making, which looks at neuroscience, psychology, organizational behavior. And more it's finding out penalties don't work. You have a code of conduct, you have a code of ethics. Yes, you snap a penalty in, but if you just have that in place, it encourages behavior to evade the penalty and find great and complex systems to get to what your outcome is. What has been better, though, is actually a balance of what they call rewards and penalties, being more empathetic to why or who are you harming as a result of this? Who are the customers? Who are the stakeholders? So let me give you an example. Number 6 are all tech giants that have all the highest breaches. Number 7 was H&M. So I think most people know H&M, cheap clothing store producing products almost every single week. They got pinged in Germany because it was found out they had, and in inverted quotes, excessive data on their employees. Now that's a big statement from a German company because remember, very security conscious. What they were doing was collecting data of people that had been on long absences of leave, whether it be for personal or sick, and having welcome back meetings when they came back to say, why were you on leave for so long? This was shared and recorded with over 50 managers in the organization. Now, remember, we were talking, is this a privilege? Is this a right? What happened to H&M? Yes, they got penalized almost close to 300 million euros. The last 2 annual reports did not mention it. They do mention the war and how proud they feel about actually advocating human rights. Did it impact their bottom line? Okay, minus COVID, slightly. People still walk to their stores. I go past in Germany, it's flocked. So obviously it wasn't valuable enough of a penalty to cause enough of an impact yet. Probably it's heightened, but they're still occurring. So the question, Tom, that you have around, well, who is meant to be accountable? We can't just rely on the legislators. That's not one. We can't rely on the GDPR authority. It takes sometimes months to years before the penalty comes into effect. And they look at 10 criteria. What was your intent? Are you ever going to do this again? What were the mitigating factors? It's too difficult to just rely on that. What I would argue, though, is who are the people that implemented this algorithm analysis? Who are the product owners? We already have, it's taken us decades, security by design. Why aren't we considering data purpose by design, data ethics by design? Already, you can do this as a product owner. Do I know what I'm doing with this data? Can I question my teams of where my data is being stored around the data sovereignty? Yes, you can. So how do we actually embed this in the entire ecosystem? Now, Europe is a little different. Like Germany, they had something in 1983 as part of the census. I think someone was mentioning how census data is important, where they said they put a legislation called Informationelle Selbstbestimmung, meaning informational self-determination. An individual has the right to pick what they share. 1983, before really cloud computing came in. So what I'm saying is, yes, we need legislation, we need systems, but we need the culture and the ethos and the trust to say, I'm okay to share my data if I get the right outcome as a result of this. So it's not an easy task by any means, but these conversations then help hopefully and inspire others. What can I do in my own role to help put in some mechanisms to espouse the right behavior out of this? But I don't think these penalties are working to date. Unfortunately, some of these penalties are more than some small countries' investment and budget to health and education. So this shows that how much of this is almost play money for them. Yes, it hurts for 1 quarter, 1 year, but not valuable enough. More valuable is, as a customer, do I walk out the door? Because guess what? That will actually have an impact to their recurring revenue. And I'm seeing a mismatch of customers' behavior, employee behavior, and organizational behavior, which is why it's causing this complex ecosystem and a little bit of a chaotic mess. But we are progressing in the future. I would like to see it a bit more accelerated. So hopefully that answers your question, Tom, to a certain degree.
So I want to take that a step further, because here in Australia recently, it's all very well where there is the notion that companies and corporations want to act and to be seen to be doing the right thing. But recently in Australia, we've seen some large corporations who are effectively category killers, who have a monopoly or almost bordering on a monopoly, who still choose to behave in an inappropriate manner towards this issue. And I wonder whether that's just a case of reverting back to just hit them harder with an even bigger fine. And is there an upper limit?
The upper limit, I can't. Sorry, am I on mute? Can you hear me?
No, you're right. Jump in. Sorry.
Okay. And that's where you do need to have that balance of the mechanisms that perhaps then there should never be a monopoly on that particular data. None of that data should ever be privatized so that they only have that full sense. We're seeing that also with the home sharing, you know, Airbnb, Booking.com, they have more data than sometimes the real estate companies on what's going on with rental agreements. So all of a sudden it's being privatized rather than the government having information to make the certain decisions. So is it actually a penalty in terms of fines, or do we actually want to make sure that the organizations improve on that? Because remember, there's also jobs underpinning this. These organizations have many families that rely on that particular income. So what do we want to do that's best for all of these small businesses, all of these consultants? Is it actually the board of directors? Is it actually the CEO of the time? How do they actually have the right behavior or change? I'm not sure having more and bigger penalties is always the case. Perhaps that makes a good use case. So we say we never do that. I know when I was working in property and construction, if some people are aware of this, Google was trying to work with the Canadian government with a subsidiary called Sidewalk Labs. And what they were trying to do was build smart cities. And they were trying to collect information and data and saying that this is going to be so great for you in Toronto. We're going to help you out. But guess what? The Canadians said, but you're owning our data. Why are we not the custodians of this? And they refused, and the project shut down. Now that use case was maybe very valuable for all of property and construction, what not to do. So perhaps it's just having the one use case and we don't just start shutting down the entire economy and all of these jobs, but maybe yes, the first one, do the biggest penalty, shut it down, and lesson is learnt.
Great response. I'm going to move on to what it looks like for the individual now. And I've got a terrific question from Catherine Bender. She's from Melbourne. She's asked me to relay this question. I'll read it out for us. Statistics repeatedly show significant increases in data breaches based upon stolen login credentials. Can we really rely on passwords? Can the increased use of biometric options be trusted? And what's the best path forward for the future of authentication? Stephen, what are your thoughts on this?
Passwords. Well, the situation at the moment is that passwords are going to be with us for a while, right? So I think Apple, Google, and a few others have said that they are planning on phasing out passwords. passwords. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But right now, the best thing any individual can do in terms of passwords is use a password manager, right, and enable two-factor authentication in as many things as possible. And that's it. Right? That's the magic for right now. So if anyone's not using a password manager and not using two-factor authentication where they can, start. Right. So I just leave that at that. That's what we should do today. Right. But where we're going is kind of interesting, because this idea that we're going to get rid of passwords. So the proposal is that your device. So at the moment, the best sort of form of multi-factor authentication would be a hardware device. Now, it can be a piece of software on your phone. That's great. But the idea of not having a password, you think about it, I go to a website and I have to register. So I'm not going to type in my email address. I'm going to let them know what my phone is so that they can contact it, and I can use my biometrics, or I can use, a different sort of, some sort of hardware key in the phone to authorize myself for access to this website without a password. Now, where this sort of links into everything else we've been talking about is this notion of identity. So I have an identity, that's fine, that's me, that's my meanness, but I have different identities in different contexts. And it's not clear that everyone wants to have their entire identity and their entire context attached to their phone. And it's sort of getting that way almost by default at the moment. But if you imagine a world where there's no passwords and your phone is essentially your identity in the digital world, you only got one of them, right? And everyone organizations can see, particularly those that run the main players, your Googles and Apples and so on, the ones that build mobile phone operating systems, can see your identity across your entire life. Now, that's, that could be worse than having to click on, yes, I accept cookies on these websites all the time, right? So be careful what you wish for is what I'd say. And it's definitely something that's going to play out over the next few years. And, at the moment, so I have a few hardware keys for work-related things. I quite like them. They're special little dongles that let you authorize yourself to say, this is me. And unless someone's stolen the dongle and also knows the other things that I have, the passwords for getting into these particular services, it's pretty safe. So that's today. Not sure that the proposed future is necessarily to individuals' benefits over, I can certainly see there are benefits in terms of security, but there's also a lot of benefits accruing to the people who are proposing it in terms of centralization of information. So
this notion that these three players, Google, Apple, Facebook, are suddenly going to play together. I mean, it's bigger than that, isn't it? It's the FIDO, the FIDO Alliance. There's thousands of other potential people. Is it really trustworthy?
Well, trust is an interesting thing, and that was an awesome response, Dorothea, about earlier, and it really made me think about a different aspect. So we talked about trust, not people trusting. One of the things in trust is also you have to trust if there's a breach, that your actions in response to that breach will actually make a difference. So I stopped going to the store, will that actually matter? Right? Similarly with password protection and all types of cybersecurity responses. The question is, you build trust not just through saying I'm going to be trustworthy and not having breaches, but also when the system becomes more trusted, when if the population responds against it, there is an actual impact of that response. And so, not really sure. I'm just riffing here, so I'm not really sure where I'm going.
Can I ask you though, Joe, because Apple, Google, and Facebook traditionally they don't play fair. They don't like each other terribly much. Is it such a delicious prospect that we just have to go for this new passkey arrangement, or are there other things that we should explore?
Look, I think there are a number of things that I'd like to pick up on, David. Digital trust is a big hot topic, as we all know, and there are a number of organisations who are working on digital trust frameworks right now. I've been involved with one internationally that will be released third quarter this year. So it'd be interesting to see what comes out of that. I think there's not a lot of understanding in the marketplace what digital trust looks like. So I think we all have a role to play educating as well, to make sure that people are aware what it means so they can stand up against the actors that don't play nice together and certainly don't play nice with people's information. I think the other thing too, you were talking about authentication a lot, and you know, being a CISO is something that's really dear to my heart. And one of the things we're seeing is for organisations, cyber insurance, if you don't have multi-factor authentication, is becoming harder and harder and harder to get, and it is costing more and more and more. So I think that's something that is driving us down that path of identity and access management at all levels through an organisation and personally. So I think that we need to be really mindful of that.
I'm going to check in now and see what some of our online people have said. So we'd like to check in with the car park again and see if there's any useful, interesting questions that have popped up that we might want to address. So, and I'll just read this first one out. Retailers started using facial recognition in their stores. The government wants to build face-matched capability. Police want to see all of our data. Is Australia becoming a surveillance state? Anybody? Dorothea, do you want to jump in on this?
Yes, all of my colleagues and friends know that I'm always on privacy watch, so I notify them of any organization using facial recognition and highly encourage them not to walk into those stores anymore. So I'm their personal privacy advocate for that, because usually it's not for purpose. There is a thinly veiled purpose that I remember, I'm not going to mention which of the banks, they were very well aware of that, when they introduced facial recognition for their tellers to help them encourage whether a customer was upset, happy, or angry. Do we as humans even understand when we have someone sitting across the room physically or virtually when someone's happy, upset? Not all the time, especially with different cultures. That was completely inappropriate implementation of that use of technology. Then there is the thinly veiled guise of, well, security. But we know those systems are highly biased and have been racist because they haven't actually used the data of multiple factors, or they've used data because it was based on, I know, Stephen, you didn't want to mention judges' recommendations, but judges were effectively racist or sexist or whatever it might be. And we use this body of 10 or decades of data to use as input to an algorithm just so that it can make racism and bigotism quicker. That's not the right way. So again, it goes back to, you've heard Joe, you've heard Orly, you've heard Stephen, you've heard myself. Where is the purpose? And it shouldn't be the purpose because the organization says so. Who are the customers? Who are the stakeholders? Did you buy into that? If so, then we will help enable you to get that product, whether it be digital or physical. So I would almost argue we have power. So I know that this particular think tank is passwords, privacy, and power. We didn't touch the power element. Power is influence. It does not mean you have to be an executive. It could also be that I stop using these services. And again, on a personal note, I have actually stopped using a number of services, and I have heavily encouraged some of my colleagues, and they will do that. However, what we are seeing is that because you feel like you're going to be left out, Audley, you mentioned, I won't get a bank account. But what if we demand that? What if we actually activate some of these user groups, consumer groups? All three of you are in particular working groups by ACS and legislation, ISO, and so forth. How do we make sure that feedback is there? Now, yes, we have the systems, the penalties. We talked about that. I like some of these ideas. Put them away, never allow them to make those certain decisions again. Agreed. Make an example out of them. But also, we need to help educate from a bottom-up approach and make sure that we have the autonomy to also decide. This is starting to already happen, by the way. So privacy is semi-related to, we've become more cognizant of social factors. So we are walking away from banks and insurance companies that do not invest in ESG. So we have started walking away, and banks have started paying note. And it's not because they care. It's actually because they're losing customers as a result of this. We found out 2021, a lot of our pension funds are investing through, unfortunately, military means, nuclear power. We didn't know that. If we did, do you think we would have vested into that? So again, purpose, have we been made aware of that? And have we not provided consent through coercion? Consent because we actually wanted to participate.
Thanks, Dorothea. I want to just quickly touch on these other two questions. They have a similar theme. One is concerned about the growing social problem of trust, and the other one is about what can tech do to enable trust, and it says, what can the ACS do to encourage that to happen? Joe?
Well, as I've said, I know that there are other organisations, professional bodies who are working down this path of digital trust, and I quite frankly believe that perhaps this is time for ACS to get some rubber on the road and work with other organisations, because there is a common good here. So I'm a great one for partnering for success, and I think that's what we as ACS can certainly do, and be something in my portfolio I'd like to see us doing as well. And I think, David, you and I could work together on that quite well.
Absolutely, absolutely. We're going to keep going on because we've got one last key question that I want, and this comes from Jack Polson, who's in Brisbane. Again, I'm going to read it out because Jack's no longer online. And it goes like this: given the examples of bias, inaccuracy, and false positives, is the technology industry truly ready for the highest level of trust and reliability? Is the industry capable of self-regulation, or should the government be imposing regulation? Aurelie, what do you think?
Thank you. I think I'm just going to touch on a couple of aspects of this question. The first one, what I'd like to contextualize is AI is already everywhere, pretty much in all the system, in your phone. So it is not just a problem of big tech. It is the problem of all companies. And I'm just going to also make another point. We talk about trust, we talk about digital trust, but those concepts and trustworthiness, they all concept. AI is just a tool. It's a powerful tool, but it is just a tool. So I'm not so worried about the tool itself. What I'm worried about is the use of that tool. Generally, if we look at what's happened in the past, it's been mostly negligent or malicious. So it's been badly designed, like Dorothy, I said, was it judges, or either they were not involved in the process in looking at how the scoring was done, or they used the data, the existing data, without understanding historical bias. So these are issues that happen when you use a tool and you don't understand how it works and you don't have any guidance on how it works. And this is not just a big tech problem, it's an industry problem. We're all becoming tech companies. So what I'd say, it's what we need is not just, I agree, there's a bit of incentive and there's a bit of carrots and a bit of a stick. But what's the two pieces that are extremely needed, especially when you talk to AI that use data that's coming from everywhere, with models that builds locally and internationally, and looking at a cybersecurity piece that's also international. It's really to help company ever understand what's the best practice. What is the best practice that's out there that's going to work and allow you to even be able to do AI? Because you're not going to be able to do it responsibly if you don't have an international best practice, but you're not going to be able to do AI at all if you don't have that best practice. You'll be stuck in proof of concept, which we see is what's happening in most companies at the moment. So we've learned a lot of lessons. Big techs learned a lot of lessons from their past mistakes. There's a number of cases you can read upon. What's now needed is to have that best international guidance. So shameless plug for ISO. That's where that's why I've driven all my initiative to be international, because you cannot look at AI just from a local perspective. The second piece we need is also regulation, but it's mostly not because you need to effectively regulate those actors. It's more there's need to be an update to the regulation. If you look at privacy, there's new consideration, it's changing. With those new tools, you have different consideration. So there need to be an uplift from a liability perspective. Actually, also in Germany, they've done a big change to automatic vehicle. So there's a big change there to adapt to effectively those new tools. So that's the two pieces we need. I'm still tempted to say that while punitive damages are not the solution, in the AI world and also in the legal world that I came from, it has always been a powerful stick. And now we see, as I said, especially in the US, the consumer regulator that's taking a bigger stake than the privacy one currently, I may say. They're actually asking everyone to delete the algorithm. It's a big investment. It's a bigger investment. If you spend lots of time training your model, using lots of data, and you have to delete altogether, that's a big hit. So that's, let's say, that's the stick that I like. But I do agree we need also a few carrots to incentive, like we see in environment, in sustainability, that has been working well. So that's the different points we should consider.
We're going to come to a close, but before we do that, I'm going to give each of our panelists put them on the spot. Dorothea, I'm going to start with you. In 20 words or less, what is the key one thing we should next do in the step towards solving some of these issues?
Keep decision-making human.
Thank you. Stephen, 20 words or less, what are your thoughts?
Make decision-making computer-based, just to be completely contradictory, but make sure we measure its fairness in a way that you can't do with humans, because human decision-making is flawed. That's
27 words, but I'll let that go. Aurelie.
Showcasing that actually using technology and AI to enable people rather than reducing them is of a really strong dollar benefit to corporation.
And Jay?
I think that we've got to consider some of the issues that we've talked about tonight. Programmed bias is one of those things, and all of those things have to come into when we start looking at informed decision making. And I actually think it's a combination of the human factor and the computer factor.
There you have it. So to summarise, just going through some of the things, we've touched on access and some of the issues there. We've discussed whether privacy is a right or a privilege. We've considered the stick versus carrot approach to finding people who deliberately breach privacy arrangements. We've asked about whether real trust and real reliability are within reach of a digital economy. So just to be clear, this is Think Tank. We're not trying to solve the problems of privacy in 1 hour, but rather we're trying to remind ourselves of what's difficult about this and to take it to the next level, to look at the wicked problems. And we're going to continue to do this with future think tanks. So please, if you're interested in this, and I hope you enjoyed what you had tonight, we're going to continue this conversation. Please look out for the write-up that's going to be appearing on Information Age, where you can leave additional comments, and I'd appreciate it if you would put comments and let us know what some of the things that you thought that came to mind that perhaps weren't raised or weren't raised strongly enough here. I'd like to thank tonight's panellists, in particular Joe Stewart-Rattray, Aurelie Jacquet, Stephen Hardy and Dorothea Baljevic in Germany. Could you please put your hands together for these 4 people? And so we move to the next set of think tanks. So the next, so you as members have the opportunity to vote. We're going to put up some topics, and we want you to give some kind of indication as to what you think are the next most important things to talk about. So we have a think tank scheduled in November, and for those of you online, at the top of your Teams screen, you should now be able to click on the button that's labelled Mentimeter, if you can see the Mentimeter, and you'll see that there are 4 options. We'd like you to cast a vote. Let us know what ones of these votes you think are important, and we'll soon see which ones. Wow, and it's very, very clearly coming in one direction. So I was going to say, we had an option which was facial recognition, we had how much automation in IT is too much, we had should people be taught to code, and we had addressing gender diversity, inclusion and technology. And I can tell you that the winner, based on our quick poll, is going to be addressing gender diversity, inclusion and technology. Where does merit sit? So there you have it. That will be our think tank in November, but we have one before then. So we've got a think tank coming up on the 27th of September, and that's going to be in Melbourne. For those of you who are in Melbourne, you can attend either face-to-face or you can be online, as for some of you have been tonight. That's on the 27th of September, and that topic is going to be tackling the topic of cybercrime. Are we winning? So with that, thank you for everyone who's joined us tonight. I really hope you've enjoyed it. Leave your comments, go to the Information Age, put comments there. Let us know what you think about this. Think Tank is your think tank, and it's driven by members. We've heard a smattering of experts today. They've been wonderful. The next think tank will have different people, different ideas. If you think you're up to the task, let us know. Let us know what the big tasks, what are the big problems, what are the wicked problems that you think we need to solve. And for everyone else, thank you so much for joining us, and have a good evening.